Today's podcast is a little bit different, with no queer parents speaking about their family creation pathway or queer professionals who talk about how they support individuals as they create their families. Instead, today I'm speaking with Angela Briones, who is the host of the gay podcast For Everyone. And we talk about her podcast that truly highlights the dynamics within families after someone comes out and how they navigate those waters. It is a remarkably interesting conversation, and I guarantee you don't want to miss it. Welcome to the Becoming Baby Ready podcast, your podcast for queer family planning. My name is Sam, and throughout this podcast, you'll hear me have conversations with professionals who work alongside people who want to start and grow their families, as well as parents of intentionally created families. Everyone I speak to identifies as being part of the 2S LGBTQIA+ community. This is your opportunity to learn answers to questions you didn't even know you had. Welcome, everyone. Today I have a different kind of guest on the show. This guest is not a queer parent. They're not a queer, well, they are a queer professional, but they don't necessarily work specifically with people who are trying to create their families. But I have Angela on the show today, who is a queer professional, and I'm just rambling. So, Angela, why don't you tell us who you are and what you do?
You're not rambling at all. No. My name is Angela Briones, and I'm a podcaster. I have a podcast called the Gay Podcast for Everyone. And like you said, it's family focused. It basically has to do with inviting our parents and our families and allies into a conversation about a topic that is either new to them or it's uncomfortable for them, maybe. And we talk about the journey of coming out to our family and then kind of handing that information over to them and letting them go through a coming out process as the parent, sibling, or friend of an LGBTQ person. So I'm really trying to open up the conversation so that we can have more of a connection. And as it relates to family, as you said, I try to focus mainly on moms of LGBTQ plus folks and talk about that dynamic and that connection because I think it's a really important one. And I think it's something that strengthens over time, really.
What shoved you down this path? Is it something that you've always done? Is it something that you just heard too many of the same kind of stories from too many people that you thought, "Oh, okay, I'm going to figure out how I can just take a step and make a change"? What was it that started you down this path?
No, it was really more of this kind of aha moment where I was realizing after I came out, I was realizing that the conversations my mom was having or my dad, was having with their friends about their children. That was a normal conversation they were having all the time. How are your kids doing? How's Angela doing? What's new in her life, etc. And as we got older and after I came out, I started realizing, oh, there are certain topics that might be difficult or different for my parents to address with their friends. The same way it was difficult to come out to some of my friends, right?
Mm-hmm.
There were some of my friends who I knew were going to be open and accepting from the get-go. And then there were some friends that I kind of didn't know. And I was a little hesitant to have that conversation. So I thought, it's probably very similar
Mm-hmm.
for my parents as well. There might be friends that they feel more comfortable with and saying, "Oh, I don't know if I've told you or not, but Angela's gay, she has a girlfriend or what have you." Or was that something that they didn't want to talk about at all? So I started having a lot of empathy for what they were going through
Mm-hmm.
with their friends and the dynamics that were around them. And I just really wanted to kind of open up that door a little bit and say, oh, I didn't realize that when I came out and I kind of handed over this information, I really essentially gave it to you. And now it's your turn to figure out what you want to do with it. Do you hold it close to the vest? Are you proud of it? Do you wave the flag proud like I do? Or are you also going through your own coming out process as well as the parent of a gay person? And so that's
Right.
how it started out, just with a lot of empathy that I didn't have, honestly, from the very beginning. And it was just this question. And I thought, you know what? I'd love to have these conversations and find out. And the funny thing is, I haven't had a conversation with my parents yet on the podcast, and I'd love to do that. I think we will at a certain point. They're kind of hesitant, and I don't blame them. But it's nice to talk to so many different parents and, people in my own community just about the dynamics that they have with their families or with their friends. It's really interesting, and it's really opened up my world, to be honest. I've learned a lot on
Mhm.
my own podcast, which is kind of funny, but it's true.
Yeah, I have to say that's one of my favorite parts of podcasting, and the different people that I get to meet, and just the different dynamics of conversation that we have. You're right. You learn so much as you go. How were your parents when you first came out? Were you comfortable? Were you, I guess, I guess maybe even before I ask that, did you grow up in an environment and in a part of the US where you felt like it was okay to be gay?
That's a great question. I grew up in the 80s. And at that time, I think the only person that I knew of who was gay was Ellen, as I was getting into the 90s, I guess. And I didn't really have a lot of gay representation around me, especially on television like we do now. I think it's so wonderful, to see. I watched different shows on TV and I'm like, oh my gosh, how great would this have been if this was out? And an important question that came up recently that somebody said to me was, if all these television shows were on at that time, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to distract, but I'll come back to your question in a second. But if all these things were on television at that time, would it have changed how you came out? And I don't think it would have. Like, I started thinking that, and I think like our own fears are our fears no matter what. And the fact that something is on television, or a little bit more of an example around you, it allows you to understand that is things are possible, which is great. I would have loved that back then, right?
Hmm.
But I don't think it would have taken away the fear that I already had. And the fear I had in telling my parents that I was gay was just, a natural, normal fear. And it was basically because really didn't know anybody at that time. Looking back, there were
Hmm.
people that I knew, but they weren't out as well, right?
Right.
So I was really hesitant to share the news with them, but they were wonderful. And I was really lucky. My dad, I actually to this day have not formally come out to him. And I joke about that because I came out to my mom. And, it's one of those dynamics that whatever I tell my mom, she'll eventually tell my dad. And that's how that goes. And
Yeah.
he's fine with everything. So I'm really lucky. And I'm very aware of that. And I think that's what drives my podcast and my hopes to have more conversations is I really want to just kind of tap that parent on the shoulder, the one who's a little bit hesitant and the one who's a little bit scared, and say, hey, you know, your kid's no different than every other kid out there, like all you got to do is support them. That's all you have to do. I always say, you don't have to be the parent on the float of a pride parade. You just have to show up, not turn your back on them, and slowly walk through things together. That's all you have to do. And I think by just sharing that little thing, I think I'd like to think it makes a difference.
Yeah.
I think it makes a difference with my parents. I think I've demonstrated to them that they don't have to be Betty DeGeneres. And that's how
Right.
my podcast started, actually. My podcast started as like this ode to Betty DeGeneres of her journey
Right.
from being a little bit concerned about her child to being the person who, is making the speech at HRC gala. So
Right.
it was one of those things where I wanted to highlight that of like, you don't have to be Betty DeGeneres. If you are, that's great, but you don't have to do that. And I think just giving my parents permission to question things and to ask questions
Yep.
and to be worried, but also understand that they don't have to be worried. That what I'm most worried about is our relationship, what's
Right.
happening within our dynamic or in our household. I'm
Hmm.
really not that worried about anything else.
Right.
That's my main concern.
Right. And I think in the back of my mind, as you say that, one of the things is And and I feel this so often when I hear other people's stories is you have every right to be afraid and to be worried, but as afraid and worried as you are, your child is 1,000 times that. And if you are the parent, then it is your job to set that aside and support your child and work through how you're feeling by talking to them, by asking them questions. There's not a queer person I know who gets asked honest, well meaning questions from people, especially family members, who isn't open to answering those to maintain the relationships that they have. But when they're
Yeah.
asked in an attacking way or a condescending way, then of course we're going to put our backs up. Of course we're going to say that we aren't interested in maintaining that and then we pull away and we separate and then families don't speak for years and years and I keep and my thought is always this isn't about you. This is
Yeah.
about me. You're allowed to have your feelings, you're allowed to have, but with me, you need to just be my parent and be here for me and support me through this.
Right. And you know what I found so interesting, especially recently, is some of my friends or people who I've come across recently in just different dynamics, different I don't want to say meetings. It's not that like neighborhood meetings or this, things like that, like really nerdy stuff actually. I'll meet other LGBTQ folks who have children, and they have confided in me that when their child came out to them, they didn't react positively, which I thought was so interesting.
Hmm.
And they were like, I'm having a really hard time with my child being queer or non-binary or what have you. And I always thought that was so interesting. And we talk about it a little bit. And it's just because there's a lot of things that really didn't exist, quote unquote. They did exist, but we didn't have it in our common vernacular,
Hmm.
at least here in Texas,
Yeah.
you
No, but I
know?
think worldwide, in general,
Yeah.
worldwide, yeah.
Yeah. So there's this fear of just what we don't know. And I
Well,
think that's very interesting when it comes from one person who identifies as gay to their child who also is going through something that like that as well, and realizing, hey, I identify as something, similar to you, but also different, also something that you might not understand. It's a
yeah.
very interesting dynamic.
I would think 18 months ago, the world was a different place, that parents would be less worried that,
Yes.
you're growing up in the 80s, 90s, early aughts, and you're gay, you come out, and you navigate those waters of people having to adapt, perhaps treating you poorly. Certainly, there are many people who have been assaulted, harassed, attacked simply for being who they are. But we have, for the most part, up until let's say 18 months ago, just to give us a wide enough span, had more understanding worldwide. We'd had more respect and acceptance and love, and people saying, that's your life, you live your life. This is my life, I'll live my life. But love is love, and we can do what we need to do and love who we need to love. But I can imagine that in the last year or so, parents who came out and who have young adult children or teenage children who are coming out to them now are afraid in large part because of how the world is seemingly dropped down the rabbit hole of falling back into 1950s
Right.
and they're afraid for their child because we have no idea what the world is going to look like at the end of this term and whether the term will ever end based upon comments that have been made. And so, I mean, from that perspective, I can appreciate that for
Yeah,
sure.
absolutely. I think it's twofold. I think it's one, the person who is the parent, in this case, the LGBTQ parent, has their point of view of what it was like for them to come out. It might not have been very positive. They
Hmm.
might have come across some very negative things, and they don't want that for their kid too. That's any parent. right?
Hmm.
And then also, it's like you said, we don't know what the future is going to look like. I mean, day to day, it's very heavy. There's so much
Mm.
to grapple with
Yeah.
and to try to wrap our head around, and there's no way to wrap our head around it. So yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot. It's just a natural fear for your kids, I think. Without being a parent myself, I have a lot of empathy.
Hmm.
I would too, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Overwhelmingly, though, when you're speaking to queer individuals about their experiences or about their parents' experience or their reception from their parents and things like that, do you get more positive than negative or
Yeah, I don't think I've gotten any negative, which is great. I feel really lucky in the podcast because I I actually worried that I was going to come across negativity of some sort.
Mhm.
But the truth of the matter is I have found so many wonderful allies along the way. I mean, the majority of people who listen to the podcast are the audience of the podcast are, quote unquote straight parents and especially moms. And they want to hear good stories. They want to also influence other parents and they want to be real about it and say, yeah, when my child came out to me, I was really scared.
Mhm.
I have quite a few parents of trans kiddos who are very real and very vulnerable in their stories. And they're like, look, when my kid came out to me, you know, of course I loved them. And of course I had unconditional love and support, but I was also really, really scared. And I had nowhere to turn and there weren't a lot of resources. And of course, now there are more resources out there, but it's still something that more people need to talk about. But I think it's wonderful how parents are just so willing to tell their stories so that they can hopefully impact another family. I've just been really lucky to really have wonderful stories. And the only things that are, I guess, a little more negative, but they still turn out very positive, I'll
Mhm.
say, is people will share, like you mentioned something earlier about, a relationship kind of being ripped apart by that coming out process. And there are a lot of folks who will talk about that and say, look, my parent was not great. My parent destroyed our relationship for, this period of time, whatever
Mhm.
that period of time was. But now we've found a way to repair the current relationship. We've found a way to kind of compartmentalize this other thing. And I'm thinking of one episode in particular where this gentleman, who turned out to be a great friend of mine through the podcast, he said, I flat out told my mom, I am not going to forget all the things in the past. I
Mhm.
can't forget those things. I don't want to forget those things. And I don't want you to forget those things. However, I also don't want that to be a part of who we are now. And somehow they found a common ground and they found a way to repair that bridge and kind of move forward, which I think is wonderful. I had never thought about the rupture and repair of relationships. That was one of the things that I learned in the
Mhm.
podcast.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, it certainly doesn't have to be just about coming out, but there's lots of times, I mean, there's lots of families that I speak to myself that have the same kind of thing that they say, you know what, we got to this point, this happened, and so we either have to shelve the entire relationship or shelve the part of the relationship that was toxic. And everybody says it's not healthy not to revisit it, not to heal it, not to process it. But sometimes healing it and working through it just makes it more toxic. So we just have to put a lid on that and decide, is the dynamic of my relationship with this person or these people more important overall than fixing the problem that came up as a result of this?
Right. Yeah. And I think that, that's the thing is we have to remember that it's so personal to everyone. Like,
Mm-hmm.
everyone has a different story and everyone's going to handle it differently. And people need to do what's best for them. And once you get families involved, once you get your partner involved and your kids, etc., things change and dynamics change. And you have to do what's best for you and your family,
Mm-hmm.
just the same way our parents did, ironically, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Hold on for just a moment. We'll be right back. You know about Baby Ready because you're listening to this podcast, so you know that we are all about queer family planning and helping you have the family of your dreams. But did you know that we don't abandon you once your baby arrives? We actually offer parenting coaching as well, and that's not just for the newborn phase, although we are there for that, but it's through toddlerhood and young children, tweens, and even through the teen years. When you need someone unbiased to lend an ear so that they can hear where your struggles truly are and help you come up with a path and a plan that feels truly right for you and your individual family, don't hesitate to reach out. We are always happy to be there for you. Visit us at www.babyready.info for more information. It's an interesting concept to give voice to parents of queer individuals in a format that is not only hosted by a queer individual. So it's not a religious platform, it's not an anti-platform. It's just, come on here and tell the story so that you can help other people learn from this experience.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's not all that dissimilar to this particular podcast. Really, my focus is to have people tell their stories, share their stories, so that those coming behind can learn from that and can pick the pieces out that mean something to them and use that as something to build their education, their strength, their confidence with, right?
Yeah. I think that's the thing. It's like, I think it was really important to me to have that dynamic of, hey, I'm a gay person and
Mm-hmm.
I want to mostly chat with somebody who isn't gay and might have some questions, because I think it's easier to have a conversation with somebody you're not related to, or you don't have that, that initial connection with,
Mm-hmm.
for lack of a better word. Like, we don't know each other. We're coming on to it, coming into a space where we can kind of be a little more free in our conversation,
Yeah.
or able to ask questions that, maybe I can't ask my sibling or my parent. And this person on the other end also has that same dynamic of, I want to ask my child this, but I'm not really sure how to do that. And we also have conversations about that too, of like, it's okay to have questions. It's okay to not understand. Where we have to be careful is just how we're asking it. Like earlier, you mentioned, things, uh, you know, coming across as judgmental or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
That's where we have to be careful how
Mm-hmm.
we're asking the question. But I want people to be comfortable enough to say, hey, I'm not gay, but I am an ally, or I'm learning to be an ally. And that space of I'm learning to be an ally is probably where I think the podcast is, with, not because of the guests. The guests are full on allies, but the conversation that we're having, it's
Mm-hmm.
like we're reaching out to someone who has that question mark of like, I'm an ally, but I could be a better one and I don't know how to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just it's just been interesting, and it's been something that's become really important for me. It's like, wow, we're really having these really great conversations, and ironically, I, the gay person, am probably learning the most out of everyone, out of everybody, which
That's
I
not a
think is
bad thing.
great.
Yep. Yep. That's pretty cool. That is pretty cool. Now, do you find overall that you speak more to people whose children came out when they were fairly young, like I'm going to say teens, early 20s, or do you speak to many parents whose kids were late in life to come out? How does that fall? And does that shift the dynamic of acceptance and questions and sort of family building, people interested in really maintaining that family block.
Yeah, most of the people on the podcast, whether they're gay, lesbian, or trans, and their parents, m- almost all the stories are people who came out like teenager, late teens, early 20s, that type thing. I had one particular episode with a family whose child came out when they were 10, and they actually ended up having a coming out party for their kid, which was awesome.
Cool.
And I thought that was very, very special. Mainly too because of the cultural aspect of it. I'm Latina and they are also Latina, and or Latinos, I guess I should say. That's where you get into a whole other subject. Anyway,
The linguistics of it all.
yes, and I always want to be right in everything I say, and sometimes I'm not. But that's the whole point of my podcast: is sometimes we're gonna make a mistake, and we have to say what's a better way of saying this. So
Right.
anyway, it was just interesting because there was a cultural aspect of it, and also this kiddo was, fairly young, 10 years old, and I remember being 10 years old and I did not have a clue that I was gay. Looking back, I should have known. There were some
There were signs.
big signs, but I did not know at the time. So I thought that was a really interesting thing. But most people have come out later, or there are also situations where, like mine, where they knew their child, or they suspected their child might be gay or trans, but their child hadn't come out to them yet.
Right.
And there is even one episode with a friend who was really trying to, she was telling the story about how she was trying to get her daughter to tell her, and she was just like, she was the mom waving the flag. She truly was. She was like, look, I'm an ally, I'm going to, support you, and I love gay people, and it's going to be great. And she was like, I joke that she was rolling out the gay red carpet type
There
thing,
you go.
and she was doing that, but her kiddo wasn't coming out to her. She was still kind of reserved, and she had questioned that because she was like, I've done everything. Like, why
Mhm.
isn't she coming out to me? And she told that story of, I just had to sit and wait till she was ready.
Right.
And I thought that was an important story as well, because just because you're an ally, or just because you're okay with something, somebody else might still be coming out to themselves. And that story of, how we come out to ourselves, that is a particular component of the story that I don't think a lot of people really think about.
Yep.
They don't really think, they hear coming out of the closet, or they hear being in the closet, but they don't really understand that during that time there are layers, many, many layers of us understanding
Right.
what things mean, who we are, our relationship with the world, with the people around us, etc. I mean, and it's something that for some of us can take years. So
Yeah.
it's a process. And even though somebody is, you know, waving that gay flag, they still might not be ready.
Yeah. And you're right. I mean, for some, especially when people are young, they're so desperately influenced by their peers and acceptance in their peer groups and stuff like that, that they don't even, many are not even open to considering, I'm not really feeling attracted to the opposite sex because I'm attracted to the same sex. They're just thinking, I guess I'm just late to be attracted to anybody.
Right. Yeah. I feel like I went through that a little bit. I remember just thinking, oh, I'm just picky. It didn't occur to me that I wasn't attracted to the opposite sex. It really, truly didn't. I just thought, I'm just not attracted to that person,
Right.
and it was really as simple as that. Looking back again, yes, there were signs. But I didn't have anything around me, any representation, any examples. Not to say that those things would have quote unquote made me gay. That's not, I don't,
Right.
and I always hesitant to say things like that because I think people can hear it incorrectly. But what I mean by that is those examples would have at least let me understand myself while I was coming out to myself,
Mm-hmm.
and I know you get that, but
Yep.
there are a lot of, cisgendered parents who are allies, but don't really understand the dynamic of what it means to be gay or trans or
Mm-hmm.
lesbian or anything of that nature. So they're still learning,
Mm-hmm.
and they might think, well, if I have this person around my child that's or this TV show on that's going to make my child gay type of a mentality.
Right.
And it's so hard to tell somebody that's not how this works.
Right.
That's not how this works. And you don't have to be afraid of something like that. We've been around straight television our entire lives, and
Didn't work.
there you go.
It did not work. Sorry.
Yeah,
Not
exactly.
sorry. That's, it would be interesting to me to know how your conversations with guests might change if perhaps you're speaking to parents and to us LGBTQIA identifying individual who was 40 before they came out or 50 before they came out to see how that transition. Because I think on some levels,
Mhm.
when we're older, we care less about because
Yeah.
we've grown past that part of our lives. We're not living at home. We're not living with the assistance of our parents the same way, that kind of thing. So, do we care more? Do we care less? Um, do we feel like we've really rattled our parents because we came out so much later they we than they would have expected we would if we really were gay? And is this a phase? And I'd be curious about all of those dynamics.
Yeah. I did speak with one individual not too long ago, and she was a late in life lesbian, married to a man previously, had children, and then realized she was gay. And she discussed that dynamic with her mom specifically. It's actually in her book. I don't know if you know the book Perfectly Queer by Jillian Abbey.
Mm-mm.
It's an amazing book. It's wonderful. It's a memoir. And she was on the podcast and she talked about that a little bit, about that dynamic with her mom specifically. And she talks about it in her book, like I said. And, she's a parent herself. So I think that adds a layer of empathy,
Hmm.
but it also allows her to have boundaries.
Yep.
And she really beautifully juggles both, as a mom and as, somebody who is the child of somebody as well.
Right.
She's always going to be a kid to a certain extent. She's always going to be somebody's child,
Yep.
but she's also a parent and a grown woman and somebody who can take care of herself. So it
Yep.
was a really interesting dynamic. And she talked about how she just has to kind of cautiously walk those or have those conversations and listen. And she's very good at listening to the things her mom is going through. She was like, my mom has her people around her who are her friends around her who are very conservative, etc. And she you know I don't want to say subscribes in a negative way, but she
Mhm.
subscribes to this particular way of thinking. Again, not necessarily negative, it's just how it is. But she also simultaneously loves her child and is trying to figure that out as well. But she's also trying to understand the shift that her child had. So it's very, very, very complex, I guess I would say.
Mhm.
um so yeah, it's very different. It's very
Yeah.
different.
Yeah. And it would be.
Yeah.
And it's just, yeah, it just it's an interesting thought process in my head. And so I just, yeah.
Yeah, I think that, like you said, with age, so much is added in a good way. There's
Mhm.
so much insight, so
Mhm.
many boundaries that we've learned how to put up, so many ways that we've learned to self-care, I guess,
Yeah. Yeah.
where you want to keep yourself away from toxicity or from negativity. And the things we allow in our home, right? That's been a really big thing for me, especially lately, especially with our
Mm.
politics here in the US. Um, just really making sure that my space is as safe and as joyful as it can be. And like for me, as a 50-year-old person,
Mhm.
I can determine what comes into my space or who comes into my space or not.
Right.
And so being somebody who's out at 40, 50, or older, the beauty and the blessing of that is there's so much more control that we have
Hmm.
when as opposed to when we were younger.
Right.
It's, I mean, obviously a very different dynamic.
For sure. I'm
Yeah.
younger, you worry about, will I have a place to live and food to
Right.
eat? Will my education still be supplemented at the very least by my parents? There's so many other variables to take into consideration that
Right.
make those children, because I'm a woman in my 50s, and so kids going to university or high school are children to me, but make them just a different level of vulnerable. And at
Right.
the same time, I think of being, being a late in life person, someone to come out later in life. You've had your whole life of this connected unit. And so to throw that into turmoil potentially is something that I could see people being very afraid of with their
Yeah.
family dynamics.
Yeah. And I love, sharing all of these different stories. I think it's an
Hmm.
important component because there's so many things that people don't think about when it comes to coming out, being out, and living
Hmm.
out. I mean, there are so many different layers to each one. And then there's so many different dynamics depending on the connections people have with their families or even the lack thereof. There's
Hmm.
a lot of awareness, I think, that comes with sharing these stories.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Yeah.
If someone who happens to be listening has a desire to reach out to you because they feel like their story is a little bit different
Mhm.
or whatever, how would someone get in touch with you about the possibility of being a guest on your show?
Honestly, the easiest way is through Instagram. That's the easiest way. And my Instagram handle is at the gay podcast underscore for everyone. And you can also go to thegaypodcast.com. However, there's not a way to reach out to me there. So Instagram's definitely the way to go.
Definitely the way to go. Excellent.
Yeah.
And I will have those links in the show notes today.
Thanks.
Before I let you go, I usually ask people to tell me about their favorite part of parenting, but
Yeah.
instead I'm going to change this up and say, what's your very favorite part of podcasting?
Oh, I think it has to be what you said in the very beginning, which is just, connecting with people.
Yeah.
And honestly, I have found like the majority of people I've had on the podcast came to the podcast as strangers, right? We came together as strangers and we have become such good friends. And
Yes.
we care about each other's stories. We follow each other's stories. We reach out, and it's been a genuine connection.
Hmm.
And I think my favorite part of podcasting is that particular part. It's the surprise that I didn't realize that came with it, which is just genuine connection.
That makes sense to me. I
Yeah.
have to say, I agree. I have to
Yeah.
say, that's amazing. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to chat with me today. I really, truly appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sam.
As a queer individual with colonial lineage, I want to first acknowledge the land upon which I live and work. Being from what is now known as Burlington, Ontario, I recognize the original ancestry of these lands as they span from Lake Ontario to the Niagara Escarpment and beyond. These lands are steeped in Indigenous history that benefits my community every day. The territory is mutually covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy, the Ojibwe, and other allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. I would like to acknowledge that the land on which I stand is part of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. The land dictates everything about our ways of being. Particularly, the land teaches us about fluidity. Concepts of the binary system and heteropatriarchy were imposed by the colonials who were, at the same time, removing children from their homes, families, and all that was familiar to them. These same children were divided by the only two prescribed binaries recognized by the settlers, and they were forced to conform to a performative, gendered falsehood. The land doesn't operate under binary thinking. It is diverse, complex, and unpredictable at times. Rather, the land holds us and all of our remarkable paths and identities. Every organism and spirit has a purpose. It is from this understanding that I strive to live and grow. Thank you for joining me today on the Becoming Baby Ready podcast. If you have a story that you'd like to share, or you know someone who might, if you're a professional who works in the capacity of helping people start and grow their families, and you identify as being a part of the 2S LGBTQIA+ community yourself, then please don't hesitate to reach out. We always have room for more stories to share, and there's always more learning to do.